All right. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us in today's conversation on maritime security in the Gulf and the Red Sea. I'm Bilal Saab. I run the Defense and Security Program at MEI, and I teach graduate courses on national security and defense at Georgetown's School of Foreign Service. I'm absolutely delighted to moderate this panel because, well, a number of reasons, I guess. This is really an important conversation and a subject for U.S. policy in the Middle East that I feel like is not sufficiently talked about. Although I will mention that our friends in the Gulf International Forum here in Washington did hold an excellent event on this issue in September of last year. And I believe you could watch it on YouTube. And no, I'm not saying it was excellent because I was in it. I think, Chinzia, you were also part of that as well. But because I thought really the conversation was flowing quite nicely, thanks to the expert moderating job of my old friend, Dave DeRoche. The second reason why I'm delighted to moderate and be part of this event is because the speakers are absolutely top-notch. I know that every moderator says that, but I am really very genuine about it and sincere about it. They nicely complement each other. Their expertise is quite significant, and their experience, direct experience. Let me very briefly introduce the speakers, and you can always read their full bios on our website, mei.edu. I'll start with Kevin Donegan. Retired Vice Admiral Kevin Donegan is a distinguished senior fellow on national security in the Defense and Security Program at MEI. Of course, he's a former commander of the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, NAVCENT, and the Combined Maritime Forces in the Middle East, headquartered in Bahrain. So you can imagine I'm going to ask him questions about U.S. policy and in that part of the world. Next is Saskia van Genooten. I know I'm screwing it up, Saskia. You have a difficult last name, who is a good friend of mine, a defense professional from the Netherlands, who's currently based in Abu Dhabi. Did I get that right? You are in Abu Dhabi? Yep. Saskia is a non-resident senior fellow with MEI, a research fellow with the Netherlands Defense Academy, and an associate director with Macroscope Strategies. I will ask Saskia about the role of European powers, the EU, maybe the French and the British, and how the roles might complement or compete with those of the United States. Next is our favorite Italian, Cinzia Bianco. Hi, Cinzia, who is a non-resident scholar with MEI and a research fellow with the European Council on Foreign Relations. Cinzia will educate us on the interests, roles, and capabilities of the Gulf states in maritime security in their own neighborhood. Last, but certainly not least, my old friend, Meret Mabrouk, who leads our Egypt work. She's the director of the Egypt program at MEI. And I could confidently say she knows Egypt better than anybody in town. And no, it's not just because she's Egyptian herself. I will ask Meret about Egypt's role in maritime security in the Red Sea, a topic that's vitally important, but perhaps a bit also understudied. So obviously this is an on-the-record conversation, and I'm happy to take questions from the audience and use them in the last few minutes of this conversation. So with that, I think I've spoken too much. Kevin, let me start with you. There's no question that the United States has played for several decades a leading role in maritime security in those precious waters. I would even say that without the United States, there is no maritime security in the Gulf. Let's just be very blunt about that. But that role has been deliberately, patiently, gradually changing over the past few years in an effort to sort of multilateralize, fancy word for trying to bring in as many allies and partners to step up a little bit and chip in a little bit more in terms of policing those waters. Tell us about this transition, Kevin, at a time of reduced U.S. attention to the Middle East and military investment in that part of the world. The floor is yours.
Hey, thank you, Bilal. I think maybe to start, it'd be good just to talk about the geography we're talking about here, because often when you think about the Middle East and people think about maritime security, they home right in on the Arabian Gulf, and particularly they talk about the Straits of Hormuz. And today, I think we're going to talk much broader than that. We're going to talk about from the Straits of Hormuz all the way to the Red Sea, which is really important. Geography is important, not just because of what it means on the map, but who's involved. And over the course of the last year, I think we've seen a lot of attention put on the Red Sea now for different reasons. And we've also seen a significant change related to United States policy that brought Israel into CENTCOM's AOR, which means when we talk about this now, we're not just talking about the nations that necessarily border on those waters directly, but those that need to be involved in that. And Israel's participation now was just borne out in an exercise done with Bahrain, the UAE, and the United States and Israel in the Red Sea. So with that as a backdrop, you asked a little bit about U.S. policy, and I think I'll start with the why of U.S. policy from the standpoint of clearly maritime security is important to the United States globally. We have this stance on maritime security that we like to uphold international norms and standards, but also the free flow of commerce and trade. And so when you talk about that geography and how important it is, I think the why is everyone understands oil moves through the Straits of Hormuz. We all know that, right? That about 20% of the oil moving any day is moving through the Straits of Hormuz. But additionally, as we saw recently with the ship that got sideways in the Suez Canal, 12% of global trade moves through the Suez Canal. And any disruption of that really impacts everyone's economy. And we saw that here in the United States, where the supply chain was significantly disrupted by this thing that went on for 5 or 6 days, but was miles away. So the why of our policy, we really look at three things that the maritime policy is based on: counterterrorism, and you've heard deterring Iran, and that has to do with both nuclear weapons, but it's bad actions on the sea that disrupt and in some way interrupt that supply chain I talked about. And our job is to protect that freedom of navigation that we call, or free flow of commerce. So in a nutshell, Secretary of Defense Austin talked in the Manama dialogue about this. He said, and homed in on freedom of navigation and counterterrorism. But I liked what CNO, the head of the United States Navy Gilday, said recently about U.S. policy in the region. We all know it's about, that we're interested in flow of oil, and some think, well, maybe the United States has moved away from that because we've become more, quote, independent of that oil. But that's not really true, because we may have become more independent of that direct oil, but it's a global commodity and the price is set globally. And if oil is disrupted anywhere, it impacts us directly back here in the United States at the pumps. And as we saw in the trade side, semiconductors became a scarce commodity when we had a disruption in that flow. So what has the U.S. been doing, to get to your question, Bilal? Well, it's been a long process, decades really, of building coalitions in the region that aren't just the regional nations. So that's probably lost on some folks. And there's probably few nations in the world that aren't worried about that flow of commerce being uninterrupted. So NAVCENT, which is headquartered in Manama, Bahrain, runs and has run for some time now an international coalition of willing nations to keep commerce flowing and to ensure international norms and rules are followed. It's called the Combined Maritime Forces. There's 34 nations in that, and it's been growing. It started out with just a few nations, and 2 new nations have been added recently. Egypt was the most recent addition to that Combined Maritime Force that's in the region. And they have individual task forces in there that handle different geographic regions and maybe a little bit different missions, but they're basically the same, from counter piracy to keeping commerce flowing to making sure no one is using the maritime for nefarious activities, if that makes sense. And more recently, NAVCENT, together with a smaller group that includes Bahrain, Saudi, the UAE, the UK, and the US, Albania, and Australia, has started up a new task force, a new coalition called CTF Sentinel. And they are specifically focused on deterring those malign activities right there in the Gulf and in the Northern Indian Ocean. So that's a new task force that was stood up. And these task forces also work jointly with the other international task forces that we'll be talking about later that work in the region. So that's what the United States has been doing. I think it's important to talk just briefly now, Bilal, about what opportunities that presents going forward. Because when you look at, there's been some significant changes in the dynamics that now can potentially lead to more nations and more focused participation in coalitions related to maritime security. Number one, I mentioned earlier, is Israel, but the root of that is the Abraham Accords has now allowed other nations to participate. So I wouldn't be surprised. We have Egypt just joining. It's likely that we'll see further participation, potentially from even Israel. Maybe not in the Gulf, but they recently did an exercise in the Red Sea, as I mentioned before, with the United States, Bahrain, and the UAE. The other thing that's been stood up recently is Task Force 59, which is focused on unmanned vehicles, both how to use them more and bring them into operations of these coalitions, but also how to defend, because we're seeing that as a huge threat in the region now to both ships at sea, where we had a ship that was just south of the Gulf that was attacked. It was determined by a kamikaze drone that killed 2 people on that ship, to kamikaze boats that have been attacking ships quite regularly, especially those anywhere near the coast of Yemen, because of what spilled out from that conflict. So I'll stop there, Bilal, because I think that sets the stage well in terms of what's the U.S. policy, how are we doing it a little bit, and what are some opportunities going forward, and if that's okay.
Yeah, that's very nicely done. So now that we understand what the policy is and some of the activities that we pursued, I want some kind of a reality check from you. Like, I want to better understand what are some realistic expectations here and the real opportunities there to amplify, enhance this combined approach. Like, we use the term the North Star, right? What is the North Star? What is the ideal outcome? And it doesn't have to happen next week, and over the next few years and perhaps even decade. As you look at these activities, as you look at this approach, what would you like to see ideally in terms of division of labor that would make sense to the Americans, but also to overall maritime security in that part of the world?
Yeah, sure.
And you mentioned that exercise, I'm sorry. So maybe that's the start of it, with the Bahrainis, the Emiratis, the Americans, and the Israelis. What else would you like to see to start really getting excited about this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bilal, and I think it gets right to the point. So, the elephant in the room is the U.S. leaving the Middle East, right? I mean, that's clearly, there's been signals of that, in some very direct signals with our departure from Afghanistan and how that unfolded. And there's been questions even of NAVCENTS and in Bahrain and Fifth Fleet headquarters leaving. Now, Secretary Austin and Blinken both said that's not going to happen, that's going to stay there and remain the centerpiece of our relationships in the region. So I think that's important, that no, you're not going to see Fifth Fleet leave. So that's number one. But I think, getting to your point, the ultimate goal is integrated air and maritime defense in that region, defense cooperation amongst the nations of the region and anyone else that wants to contribute, so that there's a common maritime picture. And to be honest, a common air picture, because of these drones and these other things can be used against ships, as we saw, are being used against ships quite regularly. And so that would be the ultimate goal. Who are we working to bring on board? The other piece is, we really like Iran to come on board with behaving in accordance with international norms and standards, and not being this malign actor that's out there initiating these attacks on free commerce that's moving. Does that make sense, Bilal?
Yeah, of course it does. What's the primary challenge, Kevin, before you go? What is keeping us from getting there? And I recognizing, of course, it's not going to happen next week.
Yeah, this is a long-term goal, clearly. The common challenges is the same one in building any coalition, building a unity of effort towards the common goal. I think all the nations there in the region understand they'd like to get there, but then there's individual, every country is motivated by something a little bit different. Okay. And bringing and sharing information is the hardest and first step. The good news in the maritime is, if you join that coalition, you do get access to the combined maritime picture. Yep. And so with that combined picture now, everyone sees the maritime in the same way. They see what ships are where and what they're doing. Now there has to be trust if you're going to start sharing the picture. And so that's part of it. And then there's capabilities and interoperability, which is always a challenge.
Right. Okay. That's quite a comprehensive list and quite legitimate. Okay. Thank you, Kevin. Saskia, you've got the European portfolio, so the floor is yours, my friend.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bilal, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss this topic here and with our colleagues. And it's, I would say it's extra nice to do it while looking out over the Gulf and towards the Strait of Hormuz. So I will focus a little bit about on what the Europeans are doing. I think it's a large question, and maybe it's worth if we start with like a high-level summary answer, and then you can pick, some elements out of that. I think if we think of the Europeans as an aggregate, as the European Union or as the European pillar of NATO, then we have to conclude that they're still reflecting. I mean, they're reflecting on their future role in the world and also their role as a global maritime security actor. Because, when you look at them as an entity, then they will be unable to strongly pick sides, say between the US, Russia, and China, but also sort of, how harsh an approach to take, for example, vis-a-vis Iran. And that is unlikely to change anytime soon. So if we look at the future of Europe as a maritime security actor, then I think these are currently discussions both around like the geographical reach, as well as the type of maritime activities that Europe wants to do. Is it a key priority, stopping migrants crossing the Mediterranean? Do we need to secure the high north and the Arctic from Russian and perhaps Chinese hostilities? Is it safeguarding shipping routes, including through the Gulf and the Red Sea? And if so, then is that mainly done by fighting pirates and illegal traffickers? Or are we also going to risk getting involved in sort of, the more serious geopolitical conflicts? They are like both in the EU and in NATO at the moment. There's a couple of upcoming consensus documents that would sort of, focus on the future of defense and security. In the EU, I mean, we're planning to publish the strategic compass in this March, and NATO has its new strategic concept in June coming out. And I do think that, in both of these documents, maritime security will get a prominent place. Now, if you look at the region here, then I think the variety in European actors and their ambitions is also very much reflected in the current naval missions, both in the Gulf and in the Red Sea area. So I wanted to just like have a quick look at the EU Naval Force Somalia, Operation Atalanta, as well as the European-led Maritime Awareness Mission in the Strait of Hormuz, EMASO, and its Operation Ajanur. So the first one can, I think, be considered also as like the oldest European Union naval mission, where the second one, which is here in the Gulf, can be considered as the newest European naval mission. So if you look at Operation Atalanta, that was established in 2008 with the goal of fighting piracy off the Somali coast. It initially was very much focused on the concerns around pirate attacks and on accompanying humanitarian aid ships of the World Food Programme. And by now, the military assets there, they have assisted around 1,600 of these ships. So it's a very long-standing mission. France and Spain have long been the driving forces, and over the 14 years of the activities, they have also, the focus has expanded to include commercial shipping, as well as kind of a more comprehensive approach, which includes diplomatic efforts, development support, humanitarian aid, and law enforcement. And I guess that is, one of the characteristics that you will see sort of with these type of European missions quite often. So that maritime mission has been complemented by two civilian sister missions, one on enhancing Somalia's maritime civilian law enforcement capacity, and one giving training, military advice to the Somali authorities and the Somali National Army. Now, if you, so that is kind of, in front of the coast of Somalia. If we move to the other side of the Arabian Peninsula, then we have the European-led Maritime Awareness Mission in the Strait of Hormuz. This one is here, based out of Abu Dhabi, and it's a very young mission, which was launched in early 2020. And it started with 8 European countries, and Norway joined a couple of months ago, so it now has 9 countries. And it's technically it's not an EU mission. And as a result, it's also more flexible, which means that countries such as Denmark and Norway can play quite a significant role. So the mission has a military and a diplomatic track, and its objective is to promote safe transit, freedom of navigation for commercial shipping. Nothing special there. So the military assets, they accompany the commercial vessels that are from these countries participated. And since the establishment almost 2 years ago, they have been accompanying around 70 to 80 EMASO flagged vessels. And if you compare this, for example, to Sentinel, as I understood, they have, in a year's time, done more than 1,100 merchant vessels. So it's a small mission. But I think what's interesting and kind of, what makes it stand out from other missions operating in this area is that the focus is very much on de-escalation, deconfliction, on staying as much as possible in the background at a distance and not to be perceived in any way as threatening and to be kind of, more neutral in that sense. So as part of this, they're also much less outspoken in taking sides, finger pointing or putting the blame in case of incidents. And I think this last point sort of, is probably also key in understanding why it was set up separately from the International Maritime Security Construct and Operation Sentinel. Now, very quickly, something about the future, as this webinar is also about the future. Europe as a maritime security actor in this region. I already mentioned, I think in the coming months, we will get a sense of sort of like a shared institutional view with the EU strategic compass, with the NATO strategic concept. And we will kind of, see how far they as an entity, sort of, as an aggregate, want to go with regard to geographical reach. I think at the moment what you see is mainly that the Indian Ocean is getting a lot of attention in these documents as kind of a key focus further away from home. What you do see, and I think that's important for this region, is that the Europeans are kind of moving towards more flexible arrangements and allow for coalitions of the willings. And these are probably the mechanisms, where groups of Europeans are going to step it up. And France is very much like the driving force behind these. So that's also EMASO is, one of these more flexible arrangements. EMASO, they're sort of, they now have a mandate until end of this year, 2022, and they're thinking of, they're discussing the future of the mission. Maybe a last point, I think for the Europeans to really sort of, live up to certain ambitions and to be players that they want to be globally, a lot still has to happen. But I do believe that, if they manage to step it up, that they can really bring a very useful and very constructive package to the future of maritime security in this region, with a combination of, economic power, constructive relations with all the regional actors, a focus on de-escalation and diplomacy and dialogue. And of course, this then still has to be backed up by a certain military weight. But, in the long term, perhaps who knows. So let me stop there and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Saskia. You touched on a really core issue, which is, and I think Kevin had mentioned it before, some, I would say, considerable policy differences between the Americans and the Europeans with regard to Sentinel, right? And that was one of the reasons why many of the Europeans were reluctant to join Sentinel, even though the Americans never missed an opportunity to say that this is in no way meant to be an offensive operation, and this is not even directed against the Iranians. This is just purely defensive, meant to protect those critical waters. The language during the Trump administration might have been a little bit more aggressive, but I mean, in my opinion, and this is a separate matter, the actions were not that different, quite frankly. Now that the Trump administration is gone and you got a new administration, especially now that you have talks with the Iranians on the nuclear issue, is there an opportunity for the Europeans to reconsider their position to join and further integrate with the Americans, or is this still going to be a separate matter?
Yeah, it's a very good question. that I have been reflecting on. I mean, indeed, like Operation Ajanur is separated from the other missions operating in the area, including the US-led one. The US-led mission has a couple of, EU and NATO partners involved, of course, the UK, Lithuania, Estonia, but they operate pretty much independently, and the main form of cooperation is a certain level of information sharing. And I mean, if you go back to sort of, why this is the case, indeed, it's reflecting the mood back in 2019, 2020. And the animosity between the Trump administration and a good number of the Europeans who wanted to disassociate themselves from the US policy towards Iran, including the withdrawal from the Iran deal, maximum pressure campaign. And it was all seen as too provocative, especially, as it came at the time of the assassination of General Soleimani. So France was the one taking the initiative for a separate mission, and I think that they are sort of, they are quite okay having their own separate mission at the moment. I haven't seen any real change in sort of that there's other than like more cooperation or talk of more cooperation, that there's in the future some sort of merging going on. I do think, of course, it should make a difference. There is at the moment, quite a bit of rivalry, of course, also within, between the NATO partners in the different missions. So France on the one side, UK and the US on the other side. So I think that is one of the, the elements that is also hampering, sort of more cooperation between the two at the moment.
Okay, well, hopefully that will change in the next few months and years. Okay, thank you very much, Saskia. That was very rich. Cinzia, Gulf states, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be amongst friends and have this chat on a very important topic. The first thing I want to say, indeed, is that it is remarkable to think about to what extent the rivalries, the regional rivalries, have been playing out in the maritime domain more and more over the past couple of years. It definitely wasn't the case in the past, but it now seems to be very, very frequent that there is an incident at sea, and that there is the asymmetrical conflict that plays out between Iran on one side and the Gulf monarchies on the other, for example, plays out in the Gulf or via Iranian proxies such as the Houthis, for example, seizing a UAE flagged vessel carrying supplies off the coast of Hodeidah. And of course, if we look specifically at the Yemen conflict, that has happened multiple times with the Houthis making ample use of mines and or what we call kamikaze ships, and trying to seize vessels or trying to attack vessels or tankers. So it has now become really, I would argue, the one of the hottest domains of this rivalry playing out. And it is quite unfortunate because it's also arguably the one domain where the Gulf countries, the Gulf monarchies are most vulnerable. We all know that the Gulf monarchies have had an arrangement for decades with the United States where they felt they could rely completely on the United States for their defense. And this has been changing only very recently. So it is, of course, normal that in all domains, there is a period of readjustment. And there is going to be a transition period where the Gulf countries are going to sort of try to adapt to the new dynamics and to basically taking up more responsibilities for their own and regional security. And this is already happening because we are already seeing clear signs of each of the Gulf monarchies basically moving in two different directions. The first one is a further internationalization of Gulf maritime security. meaning that the Gulf monarchies have become much more welcoming to other international partners that are not only the United States. They've become much more active in multilateral exercises with, for example, Asian players such as Japan, such as Korea, and have become more involved in conversations with China even. They have been, of course, quite happy to host the EMASO mission that Saskia was mentioning before, and in general, they have just become more active. For example, when Kevin talked about the combined maritime force mission, especially in the Gulf. The Kuwaitis are leading that task force right now, and before that it was Saudi Arabia. And that is sort of, in a way, interesting, because if you look at the previous leaders, it used always to be the United States or other international players, or if it was a regional country, it was most probably, for example, Jordan or other regional countries that were not necessarily in the Gulf. So that's, this internationalization is one route. And the other route is, of course, increasing their own capabilities, both in terms of personnel and therefore training, high level training, but also in terms of actual hardware and assets. And it's been, if you look at the numbers, it's become quite astonishing how much the spending has grown by all of the Gulf monarchies into specifically naval assets. And we're seeing some things that are completely new. So just to give you an example, I'm going to pick the category that is arguably less developed, which is the one of submarines. It was an issue that wasn't even talked about, and now Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar are not only talking about acquiring submarines, but actively involved in programs to acquire them. And Qatar has even already signed a deal with the Italian provider Leonardo to acquire submarines. And so that, in itself is quite astonishing. Having said that, so this is the strategy, the two-legged strategy, if you will. The third one is, of course, trying to de-escalate the tensions. And we know all about that. We know the UAE has opened a channel with Iran, specifically on maritime security. And we know that the Saudis have tried to address the topic in their bilateral talks with the Iranians, although without a lot of success. So this is the strategy, but it will take a lot of time to implement that. As we mentioned, the Navy, for example, is traditionally being considered the Cinderella of the security forces in the Gulf.
What does that mean?
It means that it used to attract less resources and less attention in terms of the number of personnel, but also the level of the training and the level of the equipment and so on and so forth. And this has started to change only quite recently, but it poses a number of technical questions. How do you take a force that traditionally wasn't given as much attention and try to turn that into a professional force at the highest standard? It's not very easy. So the Saudis, for example, have chosen a different way. They have chosen to focus on another force, which is called the Saudi Border Guard, and give rising attention to maritime borders. So use that border patrolling as the centerpiece of their sort of behavior, their operational behavior, and use that sort of different force by increasing it. For example, between 10,000, it was 10,000 people in 2016. And it went up to 15,000 in 2020. And by really investing a lot on the training that it was given. And the same goes for the UAE, for example. The UAE also has announced, a deal to develop a naval training center in partnership with a Canadian company called CAE. It was scheduled to open in 2020, still a little bit of delays with COVID, but it will eventually be opened, of course. And they also signed with the French defense company Thales to develop the underwater training center to be located in the UAE. So these are things that are ongoing, but I guess my sort of and the same goes for the capabilities in the acquirement of hardware. For example, frigates and corvettes. Qatar again has acquired corvettes by the Italian provider Leonardo, and the Saudis and the UAE both have large corvettes that could even sort of be categorized as frigates. And again, this is all in process, but my, I guess, overall message is that it will take some time. And in the meantime, there is a real vulnerability to sort of address here, to talk about.
Okay, fair enough. Cinzia, if we're going to lean a little bit more on either one of these partners, at least within the group, the Gulf Cooperation Council, who do you think is most committed to improving their indigenous capabilities, and who's most willing to play a larger role in that space?
Wow, that's a
so you mentioned the Kuwaitis. I know that they've had several command positions in what was it, 152, I think, the anti-smuggling one, right? So that's a pretty nice record for the Kuwaitis, but they're obviously smaller than the Saudis. So if you were to pick one in that group of nations, which one should we be investing more time trying to train better and invest to improve their capabilities?
I mean, I think now we have to go back to what Kevin was telling us before. They do have slightly different priorities. So, for example, if you look at the kind of activities that the Emiratis are doing, it's very, very promising and a lot of potential. However, first, of course, they are smaller than the Saudis, the Saudi forces, and that's clear. And second, it's also more targeted to really protect not only the freedom of navigation, but the freedom of commerce in particular. So it's quite between maritime security and economic security, if you will. So if the priority is to have a partner that is really focused and specialized on protecting the economic activity that happen at sea, I would say the UAE is the most interesting partner, and that also extends to other things. So we've talked, for example, a few times about in other occasions as well with Bilal about how the UAE is investing a lot in developing that sort of ports strategy, and has a lot of access. It will have a lot of access to many new ports, and therefore it is natural to think that they will also invest a lot into training protection forces for maritime infrastructures, especially commercial infrastructures. So that would make them a very interesting partner. Whereas if you want to focus on asymmetrical warfare, basically, and border protection, that's what Saudi Arabia wants to talk about, and what they want to develop. And then one player that we haven't actually mentioned is Oman. Oman has a tradition in the anti-piracy activity. So they could be, there could be sort of a lot of interesting work to be done with the Omanis focusing on fighting pirates. Okay. I don't know if I've given you...
No, it's perfect, actually. As a matter of fact, it's very realistic. So it depends on what the job is, what the competency levels are, and, what the mission is. That's perfectly fine. We don't have to pick just one. Okay.
I would say.
Murat, Egypt, big country. We don't talk about often. Last time I checked, we do need access to the Suez Canal. So tell us more about Egypt.
Okay, so hello. Thanks for asking me to join. More expertise than I'm used to on maritime matters. It was interesting. This conversation is interesting, but because as far as the Red Sea is concerned, there really isn't that much discussion about maritime security, and more importantly, how maritime security interacts with security on land. I have to do a lot of digging around, although there's some very interesting work being done by the University of Stellenbosch. But here is the thing. Egypt has been beefing up its navy since 2013, seriously. I mean, it's bought helicopter carriers, frigates, corvettes, missile launchers. These are all things that are more familiar to you guys. But also one of the things that it did was split its navy into two fleets. One to deal with the Mediterranean and one to deal with the Red Sea, so that it could react more swiftly and more incisively to various threats. It is involved in a lot of multilateral work. As Kevin mentioned, it just joined the Combined Maritime Forces. It's conducted, I mean, last year it conducted myriad naval drills with the Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, the French, the Jordanians, the Saudis, 5 with the US alone. And Egypt is so concerned about the Red Sea because there are 2 really, really important issues that are vital for the country. One of them is commerce and the other one is security. And they're both very, very linked. On the commerce side, as Kevin mentioned, you have the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is one of Egypt's primary international revenue earners. Last year, it actually, even with the whole Ever Given fiasco, last year it pulled in $6.3 billion. That was up 12% from the year before. It is one of the world's most important waterways. It's essential to global traffic. And I think if there was one thing that the Ever Given did, it was to illustrate this very clearly. 7% of the world's oil passes there. But it is delicate because it is a narrow and tightly controlled waterway. At the other end, you've got Bab el-Mandeb. The other choke point is Bab el-Mandeb, and this is where Egypt starts to worry. Egypt traditionally maintains a very conservative and very independent foreign policy, but as far as the Yemen crisis is concerned, really, it's despite various amounts of pressure from other actors, one of the few things it's done is maintain a presence in the Red Sea, just to make sure that things didn't get out of hand because of Yemen. Now, when we talk about commerce, it's not just the Red Sea, and I'll tell you why it's linked to security. Security is again, it's not just what's happening in Yemen. Egypt has recently become worried about other types of security, including serious narcotics traffic, human trafficking, which has become a very, very serious issue. Weapons smuggling, terrorist networks, all of these things are a serious concern for Egypt. But also one of the things that it's also worried about, which happens to link security and commerce, if you like, is environmental threats. The Red Sea is a very, very delicate ecosystem. It carries all the commerce that we've just been talking about, but also Egypt relies on tourism. It's one of its main revenue earners, and the Red Sea provides an enormous amount of revenue. And it is, like I said, it's a delicate ecosystem. One of the threats, for example, that they're looking at is sulfur, which is an FSO, a floating storage and offloading facility of Hodeidah in Yemen. That has been in Houthi hands for almost 3 years, I'm going to say, and it carries 1.48 million barrels of light oil. The UN has called it a floating bomb. And it's degenerating by the day. And if things get bad, if there is fighting and it blows up, or if it just continues to degenerate, it's going to leak all that oil into the Red Sea. It is a huge nightmare for Egypt. What all of this boils down to is, I mean, it was interesting that Chinzia mentioned that various Gulf countries have become more open to international cooperation. Yep. In Egypt's case, Egypt adores international cooperation, but tends to be super sensitive about which fleet, so who's actually in the Red Sea. It tends to think that the only people who ought to be in the Red Sea are the people who are on the literal states of the Red Sea. And that brings into question the more interesting matter of what multilateral cooperation in a case like this would look like.
Yep. No, that's a perfect, it's almost like you knew what I was going to ask you, Murat, even though I promised the audience I did not coordinate with Murat on this. But I mean, I think everybody knows how independent-minded Egypt is when it comes to foreign policy, sometimes even to the point where it really annoys the United States of how independent they are, especially on the military side of things. So I don't want to call it as an obstacle, but is that really a challenge to this concept that we're now all getting into, which is further multilateralization of maritime security in that part of the world? Or do you just see that as softening over the next coming years? And especially you will see greater cooperation between Egypt and at least the Gulf states?
Okay, so very good point. It isn't actually just a matter of Egypt in this particular case. Multilateral cooperation in a case like this depends on who brings what to the table, right? Because there are almost no states that have expertise on everything. Some nations will bring in regional influence, some will bring in military might, some will bring in specialized expertise, and it depends on the nature of the crisis. Is it a military one? Is it an environmental one? Is it a military one that is about to turn into an environmental one? So then the question becomes, who gets to decide who brings what to the table? Yeah. Some matters are easier. The US is actually in a better position than most people because there are less sensitivities, if you like, with all the different, with all the other nations. But it's going to be a question for everyone. I mean, the EU, for example, and maybe Saskia can weigh in on this, the EU has been asking about some sort of globalized EU presence. And I don't know how that's going to go down with any of the other states. But again, it depends on the nature of the involvement. What are you bringing to the table?
Okay, that's fair. Okay. We have a few questions from the audience. I'm going to try to take as many as I can in the remaining 15 minutes. Let me start with one, which I feel like is core to everything we've been talking about. And I'll just invite anybody to weigh in, which is the issue of deterrence. Okay, so there's a question from Francis Tamer, which I really like. I'm going to take the first question asked and not the second one, just in the interest of time. A number of provocations, intimidation, attacks by the Iranians over the past few years, putting into question the credibility of our deterrent or even the combined deterrent in maritime security. I know it's an impossible question to ask, but let's just spend a few moments at least addressing it. How do you reestablish deterrence? Anybody who wants to take it? If nobody wants to take it, I'm going to give it to Kevin because I know he can handle it. Anybody? Okay, Kevin, floor is yours.
Yeah, and I think you're talking about Francis's question number one, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and in that he says, is there a common understanding by the U.S. and partners on what are the real red lines there? I think that's really a central and important question, because what no one wants in the region is conflict, more conflict, right? I mean, the reason the U.S. left Afghanistan, right, was because it was such a long conflict and enduring. We're still fighting ISIS in Iraq and in Syria and places, and conflict, that those conflicts spilling into the maritime is what we're trying to prevent with all these coalitions. So when you have these localized incidents, whether that's an attack on ships that we've seen, or it's harassment that you see, people not following these international norms that we've seen the Iranians do from time to time, how do we ensure that they don't become that they don't spill into something broader, that they don't contribute to something that escalates into some wider conflict? And it becomes difficult, right? And I would say that no, red lines aren't defined. There's not a complete understanding on either side as what would cause that to happen. On Iran's side, it's a little bit simpler. It's probably regime change, right? I mean, if their regime was threatened, that would be a red line for them. But on the other sides of the other nations involved, I think it's not so clear. But how do you reestablish deterrence? These coalitions are really central to it, right? So when you look out and see, you're not seeing just the power of the United States or the power of an individual country. You're seeing that what you have to push back against is a coalition, and they all have different ways that can apply levers, economic or otherwise, that don't have to be military. And I think that's what we're attempting to do here. And the deterrence is these coalitions in and of themselves that actually have meat to them, right? There's meat on the bones of the coalition. They have a mission and they're doing it and are capable of doing it. And if somebody applies pressure in the wrong way, violates international norms, causes an attack, they understand there'll be repercussions from that. And those repercussions don't have to be, a military attack, as was really explained well by Maret and others, I think.
Fair enough. Saskia, did you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I think Kevin is really right there in these coalitions. I mean, sort of, showing a multilateral kind of, reaction to deeds. I think we're beyond kind of deterrence in the way of, that certain countries will not do what you don't want them to do, but it's more about like, how do you contain them and how do you make sure that you don't react in the way that they want you to react. I do think with these coalitions, I mean, and that's where sort of the unity really comes in, because what you want to, you want to avoid that there's like a leakage, that there's, that there's a way that these coalitions can be played out against one another. So you need to get the critical mass, and that's the critical mass in military instruments as well as in all the other type of instruments, economic, legal, you name it.
Okay. Cinzia, Maret, did you want to add anything to this, or are you good?
No.
You're good? Okay. I think this is for you, Kevin, but I'm once again open to anybody. This is from Malcolm Moore, key advisor in the UK on maritime cybersecurity. I have a base in Dubai, regularly consult with ex-Navy colleagues. We find that civilian vessels transiting in the Gulf region, including the Red Sea, have a very poor understanding of the relevant cyber threats. So this is one thing we didn't talk about today, and how to protect themselves. This has significant supply chain implications. I think he's exactly right. What can we do about this?
Yeah, well, Bilal, I don't think this is something that's futuristic. I think it's right in our face.
Exactly.
It's a very real threat that has actually manifested itself in a couple times already and is likely to manifest itself more. And what he's talking about is maritime vessels travel on the sea in a way that's very open. They telegraph their positions, where they are, where they're going, speed, what their intentions are via electronic means, so that because it's not a highway necessarily out there, we need to understand where everyone's going, what their intentions are. That can be exploited in ways that can interrupt and disrupt traffic, those electronic means, and they have been already, Bilal. And I think what Malcolm brings up is absolutely correct. Maybe there's not as deep as understanding as we would want amongst all those that are using the maritime to beef up their defenses so that they can't be exploited. We saw some instances where that has happened, where someone has gotten into that system and disrupted where vessels really were and where they were going, and that can obviously cause all sorts of problems. There's more negative things that can be done there, including, you could think about it. Can they shut down the power of a vessel that's underway in any way via entry into, if they're sophisticated enough? But I think what I would worry most about is the systems that we use to control and monitor and understand the maritime pictures of the commercial vessels traveling, that they're not exploited and they're not corrupted. They have to remain pure for this flow of commerce to continue.
Copy. Okay, thank you, Kevin. Cinzia, a question from a fellow Italian. Beatrice Nicolini wants to know a little bit more about the role of Oman. If you don't mind just adding a few more points on that country.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Oman, first of all, it is a different historical context, because Oman used to have a sort of what we could call a maritime empire, in the sense that they had direct influence, bordering control over extraterritorial lands that were very much focused and localized over coasts in East Africa and in South Asia. They have definitely a different tradition for naval activities, and to a certain extent, they have given a different attention, if you want, to their naval forces than the other countries. So they've given it a little bit more importance, a little bit more time, a little bit more resources. And they have been quite keen on playing an active role in their multilateral and international endeavors. So for a much longer period of time. So way before there were discussions about US retrenchment or the changing US posture in the Gulf, Oman was already wanted to be an active partner for the United States, and even to a much larger extent for the United Kingdom. So given their special relationship with the UK, and the fact that the UK has had a protectorate in Oman for such a long time, they have also been able to sort of benefit from the knowledge, the know-how, and the capabilities of the UK and Great Britain in that domain. So it's the whole historical context, together with their policy choices, has made Oman a much more proactive partner for international operations, specifically with regards to the anti-piracy activities. So, for example, if you look at the Red Sea and even the coast of East Africa, the Omanis have been participating as sort of external actors to different international missions that where their object was to stop pirates and piracy activities in basically waters that were very far from Omani waters. So this capability to basically go way beyond their immediate surrounding and still play an active role together with international players is a much has a much broader history than the others.
Okay, copy. Thank you, Cinzia. Let me spend the last 5 minutes addressing one really key question from Paul Mag, which is China in maritime security. Obviously, we're in an era of strategic competition. We care a lot about China. To my understanding, they still import a great deal of oil from that part of the world, even though they do not have much deployed capabilities to secure those waters. So that's what I call free riding. Starting with Maret and then everybody else, China in maritime security in the Gulf, Maret.
Okay, so China's particularly interesting. The question for me isn't so much how much oil they're importing. It's a question of their investment in the region.
Right, that's the question, part of the question.
Yeah,
from
because
Paul.
yeah, because that's really how China operates. China was one of the first people to jump on the potential for, in Egypt, for the potential of the Suez Canal expansion zone. China sunk over $7 billion into Egypt to date. Now, it hasn't always been plain sailing. The Egyptians turned down a super lucrative metro contract about 3 years ago because they simply said that the rates were not going to be advantageous, and that's kind of unusual. But I do think that what people want to be looking at is Chinese investment in the region. Yeah. And depending on if one wants to counter Chinese influence, if that's what one is about, then the investment needs to be countered or something else needs to be offered. And that's what people should be looking at.
Good points. Saskia.
Yeah, I think also for the Europeans, I mean, China is a big concern, also in maritime security. I think there, I mean, there's a geographical, like they're worried about China, not only in this area, and I think they might be worried even more about China in the Mediterranean and perhaps even in the Arctic. Right. But of course, I mean, the dynamic is the same, and I think especially France and the UK, who still see themselves perhaps as global powers, including in the Red Sea area. They're very concerned also with the base in Djibouti and so on. Okay,
Cinzia?
I think from the Gulf point of view, China is still an ambiguous creature, but ever more interesting. And I think what we should look at is the strategic deals that China is signing with different Gulf monarchies to make them involved very strongly into the Belt and Road Initiative. And that, I think, has implications because if they partner up in third countries, which could easily happen, for example, in the Horn of Africa, I think it opens up a lot of other questions.
Copy. Admiral, final word is yours. And weren't you in the region lately discussing this very issue with the partners of ours?
Well, I was, and I think that I'll just be real succinct here and say that China is clearly when the U.S. Is saying that they're not going to leave, but the perception is elsewise. Clearly, somebody fills the vacuum or moves to fill the vacuum. But China isn't taking advantage of that here in the short term. They've been doing this for quite some time, and they've built out access so that they can reach where they need to go, starting from Sri Lanka on through Pakistan, including Iran, Oman, and Djibouti, a series of bases that they can use to deploy not just their military ships, but whatever it is they want. They've arranged for that so that they can have that. And they have built their only overseas base in Djibouti, military base. But they're also basing fishing fleets out of there, and it gets right into commerce and what they're going to do in folks' economic exclusion zones. So people are nervous about that, I think. But at the same time, like with the United States, their economy and commerce is tied to China, and so there's a balance there that they have to play on that. And I think for us, it's in our interests to cooperate with China if they want to on maritime security, and they are in an information sharing way part of the CMF from the counter-piracy side, but not from anything else, from information sharing. And if they want to truly be on the world stage and be a professional maritime force, I think them cooperating would be a great thing. I don't necessarily see that happening, though. I think it's more about competition, and I think it's more about influence and port access, and then individual influences like we've seen in Djibouti and Sri Lanka, and to some extent Pakistan.
Well, you saw that story also in the Wall Street Journal about the Chinese trying to build some kind of a facility in the UAE. I mean, I don't know what happened there, frankly, but this was quite the news. So you could also see further interest in the Gulf, particularly. Look, I don't say this about many other panels, but I could easily spend another hour discussing with you these important matters. This is really a fascinating conversation. And I know that there were many more questions from the audience. We could have delved into technical, policy, and strategic. So I'm going to have to apologize to all those who did ask questions about Iraq, about maritime domain awareness. We can address those in other settings. But for now, I'm left with the task of thanking all of you for spending time with us this morning. This conversation does not have to end here. Obviously, we will continue to work on this very important topic. But Kevin, Cinzia, Meret, Saskia, thank you so much for participating. And thank you all for logging in. And I hope you have a great rest of the day.